Time I ever heard of Massachusetts Governor Michael S. Dukakis, full disclosure, I worked for his presidential campaign while I was a college student, was during the Great Blizzard of 1978, which dumped 34 inches of snow on the Boston area. The governor gained national notoriety for being, at least as I remember it, the only person in state government to show up for work during the storm. He spent the 3 days of the blizzard walking to local TV studios in a sweater personally to announce emergency bulletins. Today, as a professor of history, who also spends significant amounts of time in my classes on the arrest, trial, and eventual execution of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian-American anarchists who were implicated in a botched robbery and were essentially condemned to death for their immigrant heritage and unpopular political beliefs, I fondly cite the governor's exoneration of the two as a great moment of truth and reconciliation in our nation's history. Most of us here, of course, know the governor from his year in the national and international spotlight as candidate for the presidency for the Democratic Party in 1988. I'm sure Barbara Ballard will get to this during her interview portion of tonight's program, but I think it's fair to say that during that long and grueling primary and general campaign, Governor Dukakis ran an honest, sincere, intelligent, and issue-oriented campaign devoid of much of the demagogic, pandering, and attack-driven advertising we've come to expect. See how well that served him? It seems to me that our guest tonight is almost perfectly suited to comment on our current campaign season. Michael Stanley Dukakis was born in beautiful Brookline, Massachusetts in 1933. He was born to Greek immigrant parents, and so was the second Greek-American governor in U.S. history after Spiro Agnew. So I guess we can easily conclude that he was the best Greek-American governor in U.S. history. He graduated from Swarthmore College in 1955, served in the U.S. Army for 2 years stationed in Korea, and received his law degree from Harvard in 1960. He later explained that he chose a career in politics because he had a sense of injustice about the world during the 1950s. I'll quote, "Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy got me so mad that I got involved in politics," he said. After winning 4 terms to the Massachusetts House of Representatives between 1962 and 1970, Dukakis was elected governor in 1974, defeating the incumbent Republican during a period of fiscal crisis. After not even receiving his party's nomination for re-election 4 years later, he came back and won in a rematch in 1982. He served as governor again until 1991, winning re-election in 1986 with more than 60% of the vote. He presided over a major high-tech boom and a period of prosperity in the state known as the Massachusetts Miracle. And he made improvements to the mass transit system in Boston, which he rode to work every day, that are still evident in 2007. In 1988, he prevailed in an extremely strong Democratic primary field, which included Jesse Jackson, Richard Gebhardt, Gary Hart, and Al Gore, succumbing to the first President Bush in a general election remembered, at least in my mind, for dirty tricks, racist ads, and a particularly inappropriate question from a debate moderator. One thing I want to mention is how well Governor Dukakis did in GOP strongholds in the Midwest. He swept Iowa, where he had come in third in the caucuses 9 months earlier, and got, get this, 43% of the vote in Kansas. Since finishing his term in the governor's mansion in Massachusetts, Governor Dukakis has spent more time with students than with politicians. He is the author, with the late Senator Paul Simon, of a book entitled How to Get Into Politics and Why, that fits right into our mission here at the Dole Institute. He now splits his time between Northeastern University in Boston and UCLA, teaching year-round, which scares me to death. He continues to live in his boyhood home with his wife, Kitty, a renowned advocate for people with mental illness and substance abuse problems. He has 3 children, John, Andrea, and Cara. Please help me welcome to the stage Governor Michael Dukakis.
We're excited, as Jonathan was telling you, it's our last program for this semester, and to have so many people here to honor a man who has spent so much of his life on public service and teaching is exciting. He has been busy since he walked in the door this afternoon at 4:20, and he says he's ready for more. One of the things I was asked before by a lot of students, they weren't born when he was running. And when he spoke with our group this afternoon, one of them indicated, I guess they were 2 months old or 2 years old, a variety of things. And when I indicated to them why they should come this evening, I indicated the reason why our students should come is, number 1, to look at a leader. Number 2, to learn a little bit about history. And 3, to find out that you may read in the paper or go on TV or look at the internet and you can find out some things about a person, but you don't always know what's inside of that person. And that they would leave this evening knowing something more about Michael Dukakis than what they could just read about. So we're going to start as if you didn't even have a program in your hand. And we're going to progress through as much as we can get through and still have time for questions and answers for you. Governor Dukakis, where were you born?
I was born in the Boston Lying-In Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. We used to say every day was Labor Day in the Boston Lying-In Hospital. And in those days, your mother stayed in the hospital for about 6 days before she brought you home. But I was born there, came to Brookline, which, for those of you who are familiar with the Boston area, is the town immediately west of Boston. And that's where I grew up, and Kitty and I live there, have lived there ever since.
Tell me your father's name, your mother's name,
My
your siblings.
my dad's name was Panos Dukakis. He was the son of islanders from the Aegean island, but like a lot of islanders, had gone over to the Turkish mainland. And so my dad was actually born and brought up in western Turkey. Left this town in western Turkey, which in those days was about 75% Greek, over the violent objection of his father to come to the United States. At the time he was 15. Couldn't speak a word of English, didn't have a nickel in his pocket. And this young Greek immigrant, 12 years later, was graduating from the Harvard Medical School. How he did it, Barbara, I have no idea. I mean, it seems like a miracle. And my dad practiced medicine in Boston for over 50 years. He was the first American-trained Greek-speaking doctor, maybe in the country, certainly in the East. And actually, I was his designated successor until I ran into general physics at Swarthmore College. Got a charitable D and decided I'd go into politics. I mean, that's a true story.
What was your childhood like?
Well, I had a very happy childhood. My mother came over here when she was 9 from central Greece, Barbara. And by the way, my parents both settled in mill towns in northeastern Massachusetts. And thanks to an elementary school principal who became almost a second father to my mother, she not only graduated from high school, which was almost unheard of, but my mother, so far as we can determine, was the first Greek-American young woman ever to go away to college in the history of the United States. She went to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1925, became a school teacher. So I had some pretty extraordinary parents. And people say to me, how'd you happen to go into politics? It wasn't because my parents were political activists, Barbara. But you had a very strong sense in that house that you had a responsibility to this country that had been so good to my parents. And my parents used to say to me over and over again, much has been given to you, much is expected of you. At the time, I didn't understand what they were talking about, but I do now. So they had an enormous influence on me, obviously.
Did you know early what you wanted to do with your life?
I don't think so. I was always interested in politics. I mean, if you can believe this, at the age of 7, my brother was 10. This is in the pre-television days. In 1940, we set up a card table in the living room, wrote the names of the then 48 states, and sat there listening to the national conventions and taking down the votes as they were announced. I was 7 years of age. I ran for president of my third grade class when I was 8. I don't know why. Maybe there's a gene in you or something that heads you in a political direction, but always interested, Barbara. And I don't have to tell you. Now, I grew up in the 40s and 50s, folks, born in 1933. One of the things that was so evident at that time was that America's expressed values were not being reflected what happened in this country. I spent the fall of my senior year at Swarthmore on the Washington semester program at American University, folks. That was in 1954. We were running around the world telling people that we were the capital of the free world. Remember, in this fight against godless communism. Washington, D.C. was as segregated as Johannesburg, South Africa in 1954. And here we were telling people what wonderful democratic values we believed in. I took a look at that and said, hey, there's something wrong with this picture. And if we're going to change it, some of us have to get into politics and do something about it. Meantime, Joe McCarthy was running around questioning people's loyalty and I was in the Senate chamber with my buddies at American University the night he was censured. It's a pretty good moment, to tell you the truth. And one of the Republicans that voted to censure him was a fellow named Prescott Bush. I don't know what's happened to the family, but he was a pretty gutsy guy. Anyway.
We've been talking a lot about public service. And one of the things we stress here at the Dole Institute of Politics is that public service is an honorable profession. Why should our students get involved in the political arena? Why should they participate in public service?
Because there's nothing more personally fulfilling or satisfying than being in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens. There was a guy in this audience named Pat George. Pat, where are you? A Republican, and a good one, who was a state legislator from Dodge City. Pat and I have been members of a national task force on the state's substance abuse, alcohol and drug abuse. Worked together on one of the best groups, I think, Pat, we've ever worked with. Terrific people from all over the country. It's got nothing to do with Republicans and Democrats, folks. It has to do with dealing with a very serious problem in this country, which involves continued addiction and substance abuse. I was about to say, especially on the part of young people, but with particular reference to young people. And we're not doing a damn thing about it. Have you heard a single presidential candidate in this race of either party talk about substance abuse in this country? It's one of the most serious social problems we face. Well, guys like Pat and me and lots of other people, and I hope the young people in this audience are people that think we've got to do something about this. How do you do it? Now, politics isn't the only way to do it, Bert. But if you want to have a real impact on this or any one of countless challenges that we face in this country, I don't know of a better place to do it than in public life in some capacity. That may be an elective office. It may be working for an elected official. It may be turning yourself into a superb public manager and public servant who gets things done. But, you know, I've been on Medicare for 8 years, so you get some sense of where I am chronologically. I feel like I'm 20, but I just turned 74, if you can believe it. And Kitty, by the way, is about to be 71. She's the best-looking Social Security recipient in America. I mean, she looks terrific. But I've been blessed with the opportunity to be part of the political life of this country. And my mission in life these days, quite frankly, and one of the reasons I teach so much is because I want to encourage young people to have that same opportunity. And for those of you who are students in this room, I hope you will seriously think about careers in public service. There's nothing like it. You won't get rich, but you'll have wonderful opportunities to do good things. And when you get to my age, it's not how much money you have, folks. It's what have you done? So that's one of the reasons that I spend as much time as I do. And one of the reasons I wanted to come out here, you know, I was in the security line at Logan International Airport. They said, "You're going to Kansas. Why are you going to Kansas?" I said, "Because it's Kansas." But I said, I want to talk to these young folks out there. They're not so young folks. Anyway.
All right, moving on. Have you ever been afraid of the challenge, or have you been afraid of the possibility of failure?
I'm not sure it's fear. I mean, those of us who get into politics are pretty competitive, as you can imagine. I mean, you run to win. When people say to me, well, you know, you lost in '88, but you ran a good race. That's not the most satisfying thing to hear. I mean, look, I'm responsible for the current mess. If I'd beaten the old man, you'd never heard of the kid, and we wouldn't be in this. It's my fault. My fault. And I feel that personally every day. On the other hand, you know, we all know when we run, we may not win. And nobody forces us to do this, Barbara, right? I mean, we're all volunteers.
They don't. We do it.
But I don't think fear has ever been a part of the equation. You know, you run, you care deeply about things. You run because you care deeply about things. And obviously, you run to win. And one of the things that I regretted most about '88, in addition to the fact that I lost, was that there were thousands and thousands of people, some of whom were in this room, who worked their dogs off for me. And you feel as if you've let them down. And I think it's not fear, it's just the disappointment of having let down a lot of people who believed in you and hoped that you would become President of the United States or whatever office you're running for, and you just didn't make it.
Okay. You served 4 years in the Massachusetts legislature. 4 terms.
4 terms.
4
yeah.
terms.
Yeah.
And then you ran for lieutenant governor.
And for lieutenant governor, won the nomination,
And for
lost
governor.
with my running mate. Yeah.
How did the legislature contribute?
I don't think you can be in a legislative body and be an active member of the legislature and not learn an awful lot of things. About what? About policy for one thing, but about how you get things done. Now, I was, when I went into the Massachusetts legislature in 1962, Barbara, Massachusetts was one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt states in the country. I mean, it was bad. And I remember out campaigning, knocking on doors, and I'm a door knocker, and people saying to me, "You look honest, I'll vote for you." Imagine? I remember calling my mother and saying, "Ma, thank you for producing a kid who at least looks honest," And I was kind of the leader of the Young Turks. I mean, he used to give my father heartburn. He's this Greek immigrant, and he's reading in the paper that his son is the leader of the Young Turks. I mean, he said, "What does this mean?" I said, it's okay, Dad, it's okay. But I was kind of a rebel in the legislature.
You were a rebel?
A rebel with my fellow rebels. And although I learned a lot, and I think if you ask people, they'd tell you that I was pretty effective, I don't think it prepared me well for the governorship, Barbara. Because one of the things you learn, and it took me about 20 years to learn it, folks, is that getting things done in the public sector is all about building coalitions. It's all about building coalitions. It's reaching out to the Pat Georges and others, bringing them into the process. And if you do that, you find out that with some rare exceptions, most people agree on what the problems are. And if you can get people together and they agree on what the problems are, you're halfway to a solution. And one of the great things, Barbara, quite frankly, about being governor, once I figured it out, I got thrown out of the place and I had to fight my way back. And I was a much better governor the second time around than the first time around. But one of the things that I learned is that that's the way you do things. And if you're governor and you ask people to come together to help you solve problems, there are very few people who say, "Screw you, governor, I'm not coming." I mean, most Americans want to be a part of the solution. And the great thing you have as governor, or as a key legislator, Barbara, in some cases, is that you can reach out to people and bring them together and having them working together on real solutions to problems. So in my second 8 years as governor, we were able to do that and do it quite successfully. But being the leader of the rebels in the legislature, while it was an extremely valuable experience, learned a lot, obviously wasn't great preparation for the kind of coalition building that you have to do, I think, if you're going to be an effective governor.
Let's talk a little bit about the state of Massachusetts when you took over, your economy, your job.
Well, we were in the toilet. I mean, Time Magazine was calling us the new Appalachia. Think about it. You've just been elected to the new Appalachia. I mean, that's not. We had the biggest state deficit proportion in the country. We had the second highest unemployment rate. We had unemployment rates in our older urban communities in the 20, 22, 23% range. And it was bad. So we had a lot of work to do, and it wasn't just Mike Dukakis. It was a lot of things. Look, if you have a Harvard and MIT in your state, and the economy begins to transform itself into a knowledge-based economy, and you got all those PhDs at MIT who are geniuses, who are churning out all these high-tech and biotech and other kinds of ideas, I mean, that's a huge asset. But I think we were able to transform state government into a very positive force for change and did a lot of very good things. But it was only after I learned that coalition building is the name of the game. And it took me too long to do that. Now I try to teach this so people don't make the same mistakes I made.
Okay, we're going to move to 1988. How did you emerge out of the tough primary in Iowa? Think of the people you were.
I spent 85 campaign days in the state of Iowa. But it was a wonderful experience, folks. And I don't want to get too romantic about the center of the country, but I'll tell you, there's something about folks in the center of the country which is very special. And that includes Iowans, Kansans, and folks from this part of the country. They're fundamentally decent people. They'll give you a fair shot. Who was I anyway? I was this kid from the northeastern part of the country. Worked hard, had great people. I've always been a very strong believer in grassroots organizing. I suspect we'll get into that tonight. And so I was able to emerge as a very close third to Dick Gephardt and Paul Simon, both of whom are next-door neighbors. Now, quite frankly, it was disappointing, because I wanted to do better than that. And so I was sitting up in a hotel room that night, waiting to go down. There were 500 people waiting for me. Of course, that's the night when more Americans are watching you than have ever watched you before. This is the night of the Iowa caucuses. So you'd better make your speech, whatever it is, a good one, right? Some candidates have forgotten that with disastrous results. And I was sitting around this hotel room with my 7 or 8 closest people and Kitty, and they're all moaning and groaning, and they're unhappy, and we didn't do as well as we wanted to do, and you got to go negative on these guys and so forth, and I was determined to run a positive campaign. I just wasn't going to do that. And finally, one of the folks said, well, it is an Olympic year. Remember, every presidential year is an Olympic year, right? That was the year of the Seoul Career Olympics. And we did win the bronze. Ah, said I. It's the best soundbite of the campaign. I'm sorry I didn't have more of them. So I went downstairs with a big smile on my face, thanked the people of Iowa, and said, tonight we won the bronze. Next week, that was New Hampshire, we win the gold. And everybody cheered, and I went to New Hampshire, and the following week, Kitty was putting a gold medal around my neck in Manchester, New Hampshire. So
That's pretty good.
But it was, it was a lot of hard work, grassroots work, organizing at the grassroots in these states, working hard on Super Tuesday to win Maryland, Florida, Texas, and Washington all in one day. And we did that. But that was the result of at least a year's worth of work in each of those states. And then, as the field narrowed down, managed to emerge on top. Ran a great primary, and I'm sorry to say, not a very good final campaign.
Governor, when I was reading on the Iowa caucuses, one of the things I noticed that also in 1988, during that campaign, you saw the growth of conservative and evangelical strength inside the Iowa GOP. Were you aware of that, and did it have any impact on Democrats or moderate Republicans at the time?
I was not aware of it because in a primary, folks, you're focusing on your electorate. In fact, I remember going into a meeting of the executive board of the Iowa Teachers Association, which I guess under their charter has to be 1/2 Republican and 1/2 Democrat. And I walked in and I looked around, and I just didn't say anything for about 2 or 3 minutes, and I said, let me absorb this. I've never met a Republican school teacher. Ever. Maybe you have them in Kansas, I don't know. But I had never met one in Massachusetts. And everybody kind of laughed and whatever. But I just had no idea what was going on out there on the Republican side of it. You are focused very intensively on those caucus goers. Those are the people that, you're talking to 5 people, 10 people, 11 people with a Cocker Spaniel. I mean, you'll talk to anybody. I mean, you'll talk to a fire hydrant if they'll talk back to you. So you're really focused on. But had a wonderful experience, and in the final, I beat Bush handily in Iowa. And the people of Iowa were very good to me, so I've got a lot of respect and affection for.
Okay, coming out of the Democratic convention, you were riding high.
Right.
You had a big lead.
Well, we'll get into that in a sec, but.
Over Vice President Bush.
Okay.
Okay. Simple question. What happened?
Well, 2 things. First, those poll numbers are absolutely worthless, folks. By the way, the current poll numbers are worthless. Pay no attention to them. There are no front runners in primary races, ever, ever, ever. This is not a criticism of the alleged front runners. It's foolishness, which is one of the reasons why front runners tend to crumple, not because they aren't good people, but because they were never ahead in the first place. And, if you win a convention, you get a bounce, Barbara. The other guy wins, he gets the bounce. We knew it was going to be a competitive race, but I made some serious mistakes. The first one, and it was my decision, nobody else's, was that I wasn't going to respond to the Bush attack campaign. I just said, I'm not going to respond. And that was a mistake, I'm sorry to say. I mean, if the other guy's beating you up, you just can't sit there and say nothing. Because, you know, you don't have to win by 20 points. All you got to win is by one more than 50%. And if the other guy can raise doubts about you with those kinds of attacks, however unjustified or unfair or whatever they are, don't be surprised if some people begin to believe that stuff. I mean, we saw this with the Swift boat thing. I mean, that was just a disgrace. I mean, it was a pack of lies, but it hurt. And to this day, I can't tell you what kind of a strategy Kerry should have used to try to deal with that. But that was a mistake. We stopped doing precinct-based grassroots organizing. Don't ask me why. We did that. You know, the guys that were supposed to know something about presidential campaigns said, well, you don't do that in the final. Believe me, folks, that's a mistake. And let me say this to you. If my party is going to win this presidential election next year, we better organize every one of the 200,000 precincts in this country. No exceptions. And that includes the state of Kansas. How many precincts do you have in the state of Kansas anyways? Anybody know? Anybody? Somebody?
Precincts we have.
Anybody? We're in the Robert Dole Institute. Somebody must know. But I'm serious. You know, we just elected a Democratic governor in Massachusetts who had never run for elective office, African-American, great guy, but nobody ever knew him. Nobody knew him. Because he organized every one of the 2,157 precincts in the state, and he won by 21 percentage points, and he was outspent 3-1. Think about it. But for reasons I can't explain in retrospect, Barbara, we stopped doing what had always got me elected, and that was every precinct with a precinct captain and 6 block captains making personal contact with every single voting household, face-to-face, not phone banks, face-to-face. And we just didn't do that. Well, there were lots of other things that I didn't do, but if you were to ask me, I'd say those were the 2 most serious mistakes I made, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Okay. Willie Horton.
Well, that was another example of how if somebody's going to attack you for something like that, you've got to respond. Now, the truth is that the most liberal furlough program in America in 1988 was the Reagan-Bush furlough program in the federal prison system. They were furloughing people for 45 days. One of their furloughees went out and murdered a young pregnant mother in the Southwest, and I never said that. Well, folks, if the other guy's beating you up about your furlough program, and 45 out of 50 states have furlough programs, and he's part of an administration with a furlough program like that, you don't say that. Don't be surprised if people begin thinking you're soft on crime and that kind of stuff. But, again, serious mistake in not being ready for that kind of stuff and taking it on. You have to. You have to. And I didn't do it.
Would you talk a little bit about Lee Atwater and the apology you received?
Well, as you know, Atwater was hit with a terminal disease, and I think it was in his last month of life or something, where he kind of wanted to make amends, to his credit, in my judgment. And, you know, he knew it was a racist thing, I mean, the whole business, and kind of apologized for it. The guy who's working for us never apologized, but that's neither here nor there. But I thought it was decent of him to do what he did, and I appreciated that.
What kind of a president would you have made?
Well, I'm not sure anybody can really tell you what kind of a president you'll be until you get there. I will say this, and this may sound a little strange to you. As governor, I never had security. I wouldn't have it. No state troopers, none of that kind of stuff. Nor do we have a mansion in Massachusetts. In fact, when I was a legislator, I was one of the young legislators that killed a proposal for a governor's mansion. He said, the guy can live in his own house, right? Doesn't need a mansion. But if we had had one, I wouldn't have lived in it, Barbara. I mean, one of the things that Kitty and I tried very hard to do was to live our personal lives and our family lives in as normal a way as possible. We had 2 basic rules that I was fanatic about. One was dinner at home at 6 o'clock at night. I'm not kidding you. And the other was no politics on Sunday. And I've got 3 terrific kids and 7 wonderful grandkids, and I think at least to some extent it has something to do with the fact that we tried to live that kind of life, even though I was the chief executive of my state. But no security. I took the streetcar to work, bought my suits in Filene's basement. I did the grocery shopping, and it was wonderful. And once I said yes to the Secret Service, who, by the way, are terrific people, I found it very difficult to be myself, surrounded by, I mean, I never got used to having people with machine guns standing around my house. And I once asked Bill Clinton what it was like living in the White House. He said it's the crown jewel in the federal correctional system. Now, you know, that doesn't mean that I don't think I could have been a good president, but I loved the fact as governor that I could be the governor of my state, to do what I hope were lots of very good things, and yet live a life that was open and unrestricted. And about the only concession I had to make to the fact that I was governor was that I couldn't really take my kids on Sundays to places where there were a lot of people, because everybody would be coming up to me. And you know, we used to love to go skating at this outdoor skating rink in our town, and after 3 or 4 of those things, the kids came to me and said, "Dad, we just don't want to do this anymore." I said, "What's the matter?" I said, "Well, people come up to you, we haven't got time, you know, this kind of thing." So we had to do kind of our family recreation in private to some extent. But other than that, you know, I loved being governor. I loved the freedom I had, and without these restrictions. So I think that would have been difficult. And it's one of the reasons, folks, frankly, where it may sound silly to you, where I think presidents tend to lose touch, because you're surrounded by folks all the time. I mean, you can never break out of this. And frankly, I think in some ways the current president has lost touch, because there is this kind of isolation that takes place. Because you're being, and it's worse today than it was in '88 when it comes to trying to protect the president, as all of us know. So I don't know about that, but I'd like to think, you know, it would have been an exciting time to be president. The Cold War was wrapping up. We had work to do. You remember we talked about the peace dividend in those days and what we could do with it. And look, I mean, I was the kid of immigrants and, you know, president of the United States. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary, folks.
What does it mean to you to be a liberal? We hear everyone else defining what a liberal is, but let's hear what you think a liberal is.
Who was it who said, "I believe a man can be a liberal without being a spendthrift"? A great Kansan. Who was it? Alf Landon. I believe a man can be a liberal without being a spendthrift. 1936. I believe a man can be a liberal without being a spendthrift. You know, Kitty says I'm the cheapest guy in America. I think that's a little extreme. But it is true. My kids threatened to do a Costco intervention on me last year, so you get some sense of where I buy my groceries. Look, I'm a guy who sees gaps between our expressed values and what's happening in this country. It's not a criticism of the United States. We're always striving for perfection. I'm not sure we'll ever get there. I see enormous extremes of wealth in this country, worse today than they've been since the 1920s. I'm bothered by that, Barbara. Sorry, I'm bothered by that. I don't know that we want to get into this war, but anybody who knew anything about the history of the Middle East should have known that if you invaded Iraq, you'd set off a religious war. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. I thought it was a mistake from the beginning. People say, "Hey, we're winning." 35 people got killed yesterday. 4,000 young Americans will never come back. Thousands more maimed for life. For what? That bothers me. That bothers me. And so it seems to me that this political system of ours, which is the most open political system in the world, you know that. I mean, you don't have to kiss anybody's ring. You don't have to pay for a ticket of admission. You want to get into it, you can get into it. No matter who you are, where you come from, what the color of your skin, what your ethnicity. I think it's a huge opportunity here.
Let's go back to close on 88. You talked about things you do different, but what else have you learned since you ran for president almost 20 years ago?
Well, I've talked about some of them. I mean, without being without getting down into the gutter with the other guy, you have to be ready, I'm sorry to say, for what's going to be coming your way. And there will be attacks. And you've got to try to anticipate those, and you've got to try to come up with a strategy to blunt them. And if possible, to turn them into a characteristic of the guy that's doing it without letting yourself be dragged down at the same time. I talked about coalition building. I can't emphasize that enough. In this day and age, if you want to get things done, you've got to build coalitions. You've got to bring people and make them part of the solution. Oftentimes people who at the beginning of this process can't stand each other's guts, Barbara, but who, thanks to your leadership, are in a position to come together and resolve problems. I mean, look, folks, we've got 47 million Americans without a dime of health insurance, right? That's a disgrace. It's a national embarrassment. And it's not because we're not spending enough money. We spend twice per capita what the other advanced industrialized nations spend on health care. They insure everybody, and we've got 47 million people who, by the way, when they get so sick that they can't stand up, are showing up in the emergency room, and we're all paying for them, right? At $1,000 a visit. How much sense does this make? What are we going to do about it? Now, I've got my own ideas. You know, people say to me, what are you for, Dukakis? I say, well, I'm for Truman. And if I can't get Truman, I'll take Nixon. And if you know anything about the Truman health plan, the Nixon health plans, they were both universal. But, you know, what have I learned? I've learned that if we're going to solve those kinds of problems, Barbara, you have to bring people to the table. You have to sit down. And you use your position of political leadership to move them forward and to try to get some acceptable and effective resolution of that kind of issue.
Would you do it again?
Would I run again? Not if I wanted to stay married. Look, Kitty's wonderful, by the way, and doing great work. I can't say enough for what she's been doing. But, you know, she's 71, I'm 74. We feel great. But we got 3 kids, 7 grandkids. Our latest arrived 4 months ago. Grandkids are terrific, you know. They're wonderful. And, you know, this family of mine is the most important thing in my life, as it is, I suspect, to all of us here. And I love teaching, and I love working with young people. Let me tell you something, folks. We're producing some of the best young people we've ever produced in this country. I mean, they're terrific. And it's just a great opportunity that guys like me have to teach them, to share our experiences with them. I'm pretty tough. I'm not an easy marker. Demand a lot of these kids, but I'm also in a position to open up doors for them for internships and these kinds of things, which I love doing. So, you know, you can do good in a variety of ways, Barbara, and I had a great run politically for God knows what, 30, 35 years, but I've been teaching now for 16 years, and I'm as challenged today in the classroom as I've ever been. So.
You were quoted in one of our papers that said the presidential primary system is broken.
It's crazy.
How do you propose to fix it?
I'll tell you, if we don't do something about this, next time, the Iowa caucuses will be on Thanksgiving. I mean, it's daffy. We're nominating 2 people, one of whom is going to be the most important political leader in the world, folks. And we've got this daffy nominating process where states are leapfrogging states. You know, it might be the 4th of July next time when we have. I mean, now, what do we do about it? Well, there are a lot of ideas out there. I think the one that I like the most is the one for a series of regional primaries in the 6 regions of the country. Maybe picked by lot, so you don't have one region always going first, Barbara. If you want to retain this kind of Iowa, New Hampshire historical thing, that's okay, but you do that late January, early February, and then you have a regional primary every other week for 3 months, February, March, and April. So we have a chance to look at the candidates, get to know them. They have a chance to campaign within the same time zone. Believe me, that's kind of important. Try flying back and forth from New Jersey to California 4 or 5 times. See what it does to your time clock. I mean, I don't know about you folks, but every time I fly out to California from Boston, I always wake up at 4 in the morning. It doesn't make any difference when I go to bed. I always wake up at 4 in the morning. Now, there may be other ways to do it, but it's got to be better than this, folks. And it's got to be something where states are treated fairly, as I say, in rotation or by lot or whatever, but it's really unfair to the candidates. I mean, these folks didn't know until, what, a few days ago, Barbara, that the Iowa caucuses will be on the 3rd of January and the New Hampshire primary on the 8th. I mean, how do you plan a campaign? How do you deal with that kind of thing? So we've got work to do. I mean, we cannot have a repeat of this year again, I don't think, if we're serious about a sound and effective nominating process.
Okay, we're going to focus on the 2008 presidential race. I want you to comment. You have already said there's really no front runners,
right,
but on who the polls say might be ahead, with the possibility of the first woman president and the first African American president. And I would say, what role will race and gender play? And is it realistic to think that they don't matter and they will not have any impact, when we can look at previous elections and know that race, religion, and all those other things have had an impact?
I think for some people, race and gender make a difference. Let me go back to my own personal history. I was elected to the Massachusetts legislature in 1962. It was inconceivable in 1962 that a Greek American could be elected governor of Massachusetts. Not because people didn't like us. I think Greeks, there are not enough of us to threaten the rest of you, right? So, and anyway, we fed you all, right, in all those restaurants. So, 20 years later, there was a Greek in the governor's office. That was me. There was a Greek in the United States Senate. That was Paul Tsongas. There was a Greek congressman named Nick Verbroulis. All of us sons of immigrants. And by the way, I had an Armenian-American Speaker of the Massachusetts House. Even more inconceivable 20 years earlier. What does that tell you? This is a better country today than it was then. Still got a long way to go, Bert. I mean, you still have lots of issues of race, ethnicity, all this anti-immigration stuff, which troubles me greatly. But I don't think Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama will lose the presidency, won't win, let me put it this way, won't win the presidency because she's a woman and he's African American. I think the question is, do people believe that they are qualified to be president of the United States? And I think that is much more important to the American people these days than their color or their gender.
Comment on first. Being first or being the first important? Some people will say, oh, it's not a big deal, I'm just there. But how would you comment on, when you talked about being Greek, being the first? What does being the first really mean?
Well, if you're Greek, we're excessively proud of our ethnic heritage. Greeks are insufferable when it comes to their ethnicity. I mean, you're Greek. Very important. And we mean it. But I was very proud. Now, Jonathan said I was the second Greek American to be governor. Of course, Agnew was only half Greek. So maybe that was the problem. I don't know. But let me tell you, Barbara, you have no idea how embarrassed the Greek community was when Agnew turned out to be as corrupt as he was. And in a sense, I came along and, whatever people thought of me, nobody's ever questioned, I don't think nobody's ever questioned my commitment to high standards of integrity. And they were just very proud of me. I mean, my Greek Americans around this country were, and it didn't make any difference whether you were in Chicago where there are 250,000 Greeks, or you walked into a small town in Iowa where there was a pizza place, and you'd walk in and you could tell the guy behind the counter was the only Greek family in town. He was turning out the pizzas. But I was very proud of, my ethnicity, of the fact that with the help of thousands and thousands of people, many of them Greek Americans, I'd been able to do what I'd done. And I think that's a natural reaction, isn't it, when you're, quote, first? We just elected an African-American governor, only the second African-American governor in the history of the United States. How did he feel? How did African-Americans in Massachusetts feel and across the country? Damn good, I would think, right?
We have two more questions. I'm going to open it up. Has the internet changed campaigning? And have candidates lost control of their own campaigns, as the internet has no rules, no consequences, and no accountability?
I think the answer to the second question is no. Candidates have not lost control of their campaigns. They've just got to make sure that all of this stuff that's flying around doesn't get in the way of an effective campaign. I mean, remember, it's still a relatively small percentage of Americans who spend time on those blogs and all this kind of stuff, and you're talking to a guy who's barely computer literate, so I haven't got time for that anyway. I mean, most Americans are out trying to make a living. I mean, they support themselves and their families. But the internet, if you use it effectively, is a hugely important organizing and fundraising tool. And in that sense, it's a very good thing. John McCain and Howard Dean taught us all that you can raise a hell of a lot of money from a very broad base of relatively small contributors, right? And stay away from the funny money. And that is one thing, Barbara, that the internet has made possible. Secondly, it's an incredibly effective organizing tool if you're serious about precinct-based grassroots organizing. Because when you get that $50 contribution, folks, the first thing you say is thank you, and the second thing you say is, will you be a precinct captain? Now, unfortunately, I don't see candidates doing that. And it's free. In fact, you don't even have to pay for literature anymore, you know? All your precinct and block captains have to do is buy paper. It's all in the machine. You can have 10 pieces of campaign literature, 20 pieces of campaign literature, 50 pieces of campaign literature. You can get people their voting list. You can train them. You can call meetings. You can get them reporting back on how many 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s they have out there as they knock on those doors. All this kind of stuff for free. And you can raise lots of money from a very broad base of small contributors, all of whom are contributing, not because they expect something, because they want you to do the right job and do it well. In that sense, it can be enormously important in this process, in the best sense of the word, but candidates have to use it the right way. But I mean, when I think of the grassroots campaigns that I used to run for governor, where we were spending money on postage and calling people and all this kind of stuff, I mean, to have the internet available to you is just remarkable. And by the way, Deval Patrick won the governorship with the very effective use of the internet as an organizing tool. As an organizing tool. And when the attacks begin, by the way, when the attacks begin, if you have those precincts organized, the day those attacks begin, what happens? Bingo, out goes the word to every single one of those 200,000 precinct captains. These are the attacks, these are the answers, get back out on the street. It's the most effective way to deal with an attack campaign is to have this army of volunteers out there banging on those doors. By that time, they know people, people know them, they've already visited them once, twice, 3 times. Wonderfully effective, and you can get that message out instantly, right? To 200,000 people, to 1 million people. I mean, we've never had anything quite like this, but candidates have to use it effectively.
Let's close talking about your wife, Kitty. In 1990, your wife went public with her personal story of addiction to alcohol and prescription drugs, as well as her experience with depression. How's Kitty doing today?
Kitty's doing great today. But let me tell you why. Beginning in about 1982, Kitty, for reasons nobody can explain, because nobody can really explain depression, began experiencing these recurring cycles of depression, about every 9 months. She had the best doctors. She had the latest medications, therapy, all this kind of stuff. None of it helped her. She'd finally come out of these terrible depressions. She'd be okay for about 9 months. Then she'd start feeling crummy again. Down she'd go again. This went on, folks, for 17 years. And the drinking
was... Why she was using alcohol and drug pills?
Only when this happened. 17 years after it first began, a doctor at the Massachusetts General Hospital said to her, pretty obvious that these medications just aren't working for you. I think you ought to try electroconvulsive therapy. Shock, right? One flew over the cuckoo's nest, all this kind of stuff. And we had the same reaction everybody else did. Well, we sat down with John Matthews and Charlie Welch, who's the ECT specialist at the Massachusetts General. They showed us a videotape of people that had had the treatment. Kitty said, well, it wasn't a question of if it happens again. When it happens again, I'm going to try it. And it's not an exaggeration, folks, to say that electroconvulsive therapy has been a miracle in my wife's life. She still cycles. In fact, she just went through a series of treatments last couple of weeks. But the first treatment ends the depression. I mean, it's extraordinary. And as I think some of you know, she felt so strongly about this that she and Larry Ty, who was one of the Boston Globe's top health reporters, decided to do a book on electroconvulsive therapy, which is a combination of Kitty's story and some terrific research that Ty has done about the treatment and its history and so on and so forth. And she's now all over the country talking about this. And I tell you, my wife is saving lives every day. She was just speaking last night. 20 people came up to her and said, we had ECT because of your book. How are you feeling? Terrific. And the fact of the matter is, it's not what it used to be. I mean, it's painless. It's easier than going to the dentist. But that's what she's doing, and I am very, very proud of her. And people say, well, you know, you're very courageous. She said, it's not about courage. It's about trying to share the experience I've had with other people who are suffering terribly from depression. And you know, the antidepressants are only good, Barb, in about 40-45% of the cases. ECT is effective in 80% of the cases. Now, why a shot of electricity does that, nobody knows. But then, why does a shot of electricity restart a heart? I don't know. So, and I'm not kidding you, she's the best-looking Social Security. If there were a beauty contest for Social Security recipients, she'd win on a walk. So we're, you know, she's engaged. And you know, we've got a great life, folks. You know, we're disappointed, obviously. Love to spend some time in the White House, but
we'll say they've been married 44 years.
44 years, yeah.
44 years.
And it's more fun today than it was the day I married her. You know.
All right.
We have a great time, and we're blessed with 3 wonderful kids and these 7 grandkids. So life is good. I'm just worried about the country, folks. That's what I'm worried about. So
we will give them a chance to ask questions. Okay. I hope you've learned a little bit about his personal life, the professional that you read about, you knew about, but also how there is a life after you run an election, you win an election, you lose an election, and you go on. And teaching, with all of his experience, has made the difference. For those of you who have questions, let me know. Okay, well, where's this?
Got a microphone here someplace.
This person first. I saw the hand, and then you, please.
Governor Dukakis, my name is Robert Stevenson. You probably was the last. We're coming through.
Okay.
You probably one of the last celebrities to be drafted into the military. Did you serve concurrently with Elvis Presley?
Did I serve with what?
Elvis Presley.
I never ran into Presley because I think he was in Germany, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Well, I was in Korea.
Yeah.
I was 7 miles from the DMZ. I don't remember Presley ever showing up 7 miles from the DMZ.
My other question is, could you tell a little bit about your part-time job as a barber?
As a barber?
Yes.
Well, it's an interesting story. Thanks for, you know, I talked about what life was like in the 40s and 50s growing up in the United States. When I arrived at Swarthmore College, 9 miles southwest of Philadelphia, in 1951, we had just a handful of African American or 3 Nigerian students, in point of fact. But I don't think we had more than 5 or 6 black kids on the campus. This was, you know, the liberal Quaker institution outside of Philadelphia. And the barber shops in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, would not cut the hair of black kids. Well, never one to pass up an opportunity to combined my commitment to social justice with economic opportunity, I and some of my buddies organized a boycott of the Swarthmore barbershops. And I became the campus barber without the benefit of a license. Don't tell the barber board in Pennsylvania that I cut hair illegally. And I actually made my walking around money cutting hair. But can you imagine that? This wasn't 9 miles southwest of Birmingham, folks. It was 9 miles southwest of Philadelphia. But then, in the 40s, during World War II, when the Philadelphia Bus Company, which at that time was the private bus company that ran the Philadelphia buses, hired its first black bus driver, 9,000 white guys went on strike and said they wouldn't work with him. This was the United States of America. Black guys were getting killed overseas, and they couldn't drive a bus in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's outrageous. So that's how I became the campus barber. And it was good from an economic standpoint, and I hope we struck a blow for social justice at the same time.
And they got their hair cut.
They got their hair cut.
Right here.
May I tell you, I told a story at Swarthmore, and one of the vice presidents of Swarthmore, an African-American, who had been recruited to go to a private school, he was a D.C., black kid in D.C., in Washington, D.C., recruited to go to a private school in western Massachusetts, said, you know something? The barbers in Lenox, Massachusetts wouldn't cut the hair of black kids. And the headmaster, who was a Swarthmore graduate, said, okay, no student in this school will go to your barbershops ever again. He brought barbers in from Pittsfield. I mean, that was the U.S. of A., folks, when I was growing up. So if you wonder, Barbara, where this sense of social injustice came from, I mean, I looked at this stuff and I said, this is outrageous. It's unacceptable. I mean, it's not what I'm being taught in schools and so forth. It's happening out there.
Okay, right here, please.
Mark Bender. You said a few moments ago, actually quite a few moments ago, words to the effect that you had no idea how John Kerry should have responded to the Swift boat thing.
Right.
I don't quite believe that. I think you have an idea, but if you really have no idea, you can ask me as a retired military officer how I think he should have responded. And I will stand back up with a theory, and you can respond.
Do you want to go first, or you want me to go? No, let me say this to you. With the benefit of hindsight, I would say this, that if this happens, and it's an attack by one of these so-called independent committees, it's just like the original Willie Horton ad was a product of a so-called independent committee, but Roger Ailes had called the guy 19 times, right? I mean, anybody who thinks that the Bush campaign was not involved in the Swift boat attacks believes in the truth theory. I think you have to place responsibility for that kind of thing right squarely in the lap of your opponent, and you can't let them up. But, I'm frank to say...
I'm sorry, we can't have a dialogue.
Okay,
in
well,
the question.
can you make it quickly? Yes. What would you do? Give it to me in 2 sentences.
Okay. I would have created a check or speech.
Just a minute.
Hold on. Yeah.
This is deviating a little bit from what we
Okay.
usually do,
Go ahead.
okay? But
Yeah.
he's requesting it. I just want you to know that. Go
If
ahead.
I were John Kerry, I would have had a checker speech moment with some drama and taken the issue on head-on and say, if the Navy needs my medals back, they will take them out of my records. And I would then follow that with the with the commercial or whatever you guys call that stuff, of that guy that said he pulled me out of the water when that happened at the Democratic Convention. And I would like to know how George Bush would respond to that with his dental records from Alabama.
Well, look, that was the alternative, and maybe it had been the right thing. Maybe it was time to take on Bush and that whole crowd and compare military records. All I'm saying to you is that I'm not sure I'm good enough to be able to do that. There are other people that might, but I'm not sure I'm good enough to do that.
Thank you. Question right there, please.
Looking back on the last 7 years of the Bush administration, I find it hard to find a lot of great successes, but a lot of weaknesses and a lot of mishaps. What do you feel is the biggest mishap of the last 7 years of the Bush administration? And then what do you think is the greatest success that's come of the last 7 years?
Can I be subtle about this? Look, I think he's the worst president of my lifetime. But, and I think this stupid war has to be one of the worst mistakes in the history of American foreign policy. You know, one of the reasons we study history, at least I hope one of the reasons, we've got a few historians in the room, one of the reasons we study history is because presumably it teaches us lessons. Folks, anybody who knew anything about the history of Iraq and the Middle East, and you know, Iraq is not a country, you know that. It's an artifact. It was created by the Brits. It didn't exist. Anybody who knew anything about the history of the Middle East and Iraq should have known that if you invaded the place, it would set off a religious war, guaranteed. And it has. And in any event, whatever you thought of Saddam, and none of us thought much about Saddam, he wasn't the guy that was causing our problems. It was the other guy who's still alive, somewhere up there in the mountains. Terrible mistake. And by the way, in case you've missed it, it's costing us $4 billion a week. We can't insure the uninsured kids of working people in this country, but we can spend $4 billion a week on this fiasco. Now, what's good about the Bush administration? It's not that I love everything about the No Child Left Behind bill, but I think he deserves credit for having gotten the federal government deeply and actively engaged in public education in a way that has never happened before. Now, I think we could do some modifying of that. I think we're getting kind of test happy. I don't know that you have to test kids every single year. How about the 4th, 7th, and 10th grades? But there has to be accountability in the public school system. And after all, it was the President and Senator Kennedy who put that bill together. So I think, you know, when his record is assessed, and I think that leadership on the public education front is a plus. And I hope we can build on that. But overall, I don't have much good to say about this administration, and I really think that war is just literally will go down in history as one of the great, great mistakes in American foreign policy.
Question?
Hi. Thank you. Okay. My name is Jake Dorman, and I actually teach history at this institution, and I'm wondering if you could comment for us about the history of the rise of the Republican right in this country, going back not just to Reagan in 1980, but Reagan in 68 and before, or sorry, 66, when he was elected governor of California, and then Nixon, who followed him in 68, and both of those gaining a lot of cues, both from Goldwater in 64 and from the campaigns of Governor Wallace. How do you explain the overall ascendancy of the conservative movement, and what has that movement appealed to in the American psyche and in the American people and the American socioeconomic pattern that Democrats haven't been able to appeal to?
Well, let me say two things. First, I don't know that it's in the ascendancy. I mean, the Democrats took over Congress, didn't they? You know, I hope and expect, and I'm not, this is just a wish. I mean, I think if we do our job and do it well, Democratic majorities in the Congress ought to grow in this coming election. So I don't know that it's in the ascendancy. On the other hand, you're a historian. I mean, there's always been a conservative movement in this country. When I was a kid, well, not a kid, when I was a teenager, I remember those billboards saying, get the UN out of the U.S. and the U.S. out of the UN. Anybody old enough to remember those? I remember billboards saying, impeach Earl Warren, a good Republican. Remember those? I mean, there's always been that side of American politics. I don't know whether it appeals to certain aspects of the American psyche. I mean, we're going through a period now of reaction immigration. We've been going through this for a long time, folks. When I was a kid, some of you are old enough to remember this, we took 120,000 Japanese Americans and put them in concentration camps. Many of them were citizens. How did that happen? Franklin Roosevelt was the president, and the Supreme Court of the United States, with people like Robert Jackson and Hugo Black, said it was okay. But notice, it's always when national security is threatened, then we start reacting. So, I don't see anything new about this. I mean, it recurs from time to time, and it's part of political life here and elsewhere. And for those of us who don't share those views, our job is to go out and try to convince people that there's a better way to do things. And my concern with my party these days is that we've forgotten how to do precinct-based grassroots organizing, and we better get back to this fast. And I mean fast. Because if we don't organize those 200,000 precincts in this country in every one of the 50 states, and forget about this red-blue stuff, I think that's a lot of baloney, folks. I mean, this state's a red state, right? So how come you have a woman Democratic governor? How come the government of Oklahoma, the state government of Oklahoma, is Democratic? How come the state government of Colorado is Democratic? And the state government of Montana is Democratic? And Arizona's got a woman Democratic governor. I mean, these are supposed to be red states. And I think too many Democrats are kind of buying into that. We're not even competing in these states. I think that's a losing strategy. We should be competing in every precinct in every one of the 50 states in this country. And it doesn't cost anything, you know. It's all volunteer driven. But there will always be conservatives and a conservative movement. I mean, that's part of our history. We tend to forget it because you have things like the New Deal where people reacted, and you had FDR and so on and so forth. But, you know, it's been a pretty consistent thread throughout American history, and I think personally right now it's in eclipse. I think the neocons and that whole right-wing thing is kind of confused, and where they're going and all this kind of stuff, but that does not mean that winning the presidency next year is going to be easy. Anybody who thinks that is kidding themselves. That's why I think organizing at the grassroots is just so important. And we'd better get on with it.
Okay. Do we have a question in the back? I'm coming back this way, but I want to go back.
Thank you for this evening. You've been so heavily involved in the whole issue of health care. I was interested that the Republican debate the other evening didn't get to that subject. I imagine it wasn't long enough time to the 2-hour period.
Probably spent half their time on immigration, right?
That's right. Can you give us some advice how we can raise that to the kind of urgency that it obviously must have? You've got corporations that can't handle the costs of that. You've got unions who would want it. It sounds like everybody would buy into this, but we can't get it on the agenda because somebody's going to use that nasty word, socialized.
In fact, Giuliani used it 31 times in describing the Clinton, Edwards, and Obama health plans. The guy ought to be ashamed of himself. Didn't he run the Medicaid program in the city of New York? I mean, I think the government's involved in Medicaid, isn't it?
He helps.
Now, look, I'm as baffled as you are. Those of us who are 65 or older are covered by Medicare, right? How is it? Pretty good. In fact, it's probably the most popular social program in America, right? Try to abolish it. Now, don't get me into Part D. I mean, that's a whole other thing. But why shouldn't all Americans at least have the opportunity to be covered by Medicare? Anyway, how about the VA, which, by the way, these days gets very, very good marks for the health care they provide? How do you explain that? So, as I think I said, I mean, when people say to me, what are you for? I say, I'm for Truman. That's universal Medicare, and if I can't get that, I'm for Nixon. Nixon proposed universal health care. Are you aware of this? 1971? Now, he wanted to be employer-based. He wanted all employers and employees to contribute at the workplace with a kind of expanded Medicaid program to cover people who otherwise are uninsured because they're temporarily unemployed or whatever. That's one alternative. It's not a bad alternative. I don't think it's as good as universal Medicare. What do we got now? I don't know. Can anybody describe this system? Is it a system? It's chaos. Ask your doctor what it's like to deal with this system these days. Ask patients. And not only that, but to repeat what I said earlier, folks, it's costing us not 10% more or 20% more or 30% more. It's costing us 100% more than healthcare systems in other advanced industrialized countries, all of whom provide universal coverage with better health outcomes, lower infant mortality, higher life expectancy. How do you explain this? Well, I'll tell you what's happening. I mean, 20 to 25 to 30% of the premium dollar is going for overhead. 2% of Medicare goes for overhead. 2% of Medicare. Now, is the government going to be involved? Of course it's going to be involved. 50% of all the health care spending in the United States today comes from government. Ridiculous to say the government is not going to be involved. But I don't know. I can tell you that I think the Medicare system works extremely well. And if it works well for those of us who are 65 and older, why can't it work well for folks that are less than 65? Or at least why shouldn't they have the option to be part of that? So there we are. Now, what's it going to take to get universal and affordable health coverage in this country? A president and a Congress that are committed to it. You'll never get it. Hey, we got a president that doesn't even think that the kids of uninsured working people are entitled to health care. Can you believe that? And when asked where these kids were going to get health care, you know what he said? He said they can always go to the emergency room. I mean, that's the dumbest statement I've ever heard. I'm sorry. I mean no disrespect to the guy, but he can't understand the health care system when he suggests that the best place for kids to get health care is in the emergency room. Every child in this country ought to have a pediatrician. And when they get sick, they ought to be able to go to that doctor for a heck of a lot less than the $1,000 it costs to cross the threshold of an emergency room. Now, I don't know how you feel about it. Feel free to disagree with me, but we're spending over $2 trillion a year in health care, folks. And we can't insure everybody in this country, especially our kids. I refuse to believe that.
Another question? Wait for the mic. Okay.
Governor Dukakis, I'm a student here at KU.
You need to turn it up.
Can you speak up a little louder?
Governor Dukakis, I'm a student here at KU in communication, and I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts to share with us that might run through your head as you watch the evening news or the Sunday news analysis shows about how the media is covering campaign issues?
I never watch the Sunday shows. I never watch the Sunday shows. And I strongly recommend that you not watch them either. It's a lot of chatter, you know. It really doesn't have much to do with reality.
Thank you. Another question. Where's the mic, please? All right, right there.
Hi, Governor. My name is Beth Ennis, and just wanted to say that I lived in Boston from 1983 to 1986, so had a little bit of first-hand
I was your
knowledge.
governor.
Yes, sir. My question, real quick, is how do you feel about the Electoral College? My thinking is
It ought to be abolished.
Thank you.
It has
Agree.
absolutely... No, I mean...
Well, we keep them like that.
And let me say this. I don't know why there isn't more public agitation for this. I mean, all of you know, speaking of history, where the Electoral College came from. No disrespect to the framers of the Constitution. They were remarkable people. But they were 55 white guys who met in secret in Philadelphia, put together a Constitution, and really didn't trust the common man. Forget about women and people of color. Ladies, you couldn't vote in those days. And it took a century before you could, more than a century. And the same with people of color. White guys who didn't have property couldn't vote in those days, and yet they still weren't willing to allow that limited electorate to vote for the President of the United States. They wanted them to vote for guys like them, and then they'd make the decision. That's where the Electoral College came from. Well, over time, people began demanding that the electors tell them who they were going to vote for, and so you got a kind of half-baked popular election. But there's absolutely no reason under the sun why we ought to have an electoral college today. If the Republican wins the presidency with a majority, he or she should get it. Same with the Democrat. I don't care who it is. And by the way, here's a question for you. Who was the last president to seriously propose the abolition of the Electoral College? If you know the answer to this question, you don't have to take the final. Anybody? No? No? Richard Milhouse Nixon. He was elected, you remember, in 68, and there was the whole George Wallace thing, and Wallace almost threw the thing into the House of Representatives. And so he proposed the abolition of the Electoral College. Got a huge vote in favor of abolition from the House. Something like 330 to 70 or something. Went to the Senate. What do you think happened?
They didn't do anything.
Well, those old, white, Southern, racist senators filibustered the thing to death. That was in 1969. But after what happened in the year 2000, I don't know why there wasn't a public surge and outrage over this thing. But there's absolutely no reason under the sun to have an electoral college these days. You know, whoever wins the vote wins the presidency. That's the way it ought to be, it seems to me.
Okay, do we have a question way back there? And then I want the mic to come back because there's a person who's had their hand in front, okay?
Yes, earlier you mentioned that you have, that the anti-immigrant sentiment in this country troubles you deeply. Could you please elaborate on that?
Well, look, I'm the son of immigrants, one of whom became a doctor and one of whom became a school teacher, and made their own unique contribution to this country. And if it weren't for wave after wave of immigration in the United States, we wouldn't be who we are. That doesn't mean I support illegal immigration. I don't. And I think there was precious little enforcement of the 1986 immigration law, which was supposed to deal with the problem, especially by requiring, and by the way, helping employers to make that determination at the workplace. But the idea that we're going to send 12 million people back someplace is preposterous. And so the question, it seems to me, is how do we deal with this problem, even while we are trying to get a lot tougher on enforcement than we have been, and we really haven't, you know, under administrations of both parties, while at the same time dealing with these 12 million folks and their kids, many of whom are American citizens by virtue of birth. And I thought that the approach that the president, by the way, another plus for the president in my judgment, the approach that the president, McCain, Kennedy, that kind of bipartisan coalition came up with, this notion of earned citizenship, made a lot of sense. Well, as you could tell if you saw the Republican debate, was it last night? I think it was last night.
You too.
And I suppose I can't leave this gathering without commenting on the former governor of Massachusetts who's now running for the presidency. Can I put it in as subtle a fashion as I possibly can? Mitt Romney is a fraud. With a capital F. Oh, I'm serious. I'm serious. He's been attacking Giuliani because New York was a sanctuary city. We have 4 of them in Massachusetts. Never said a word about it when he was governor. As late as 2005, he was commending the Bush, McCain, Kennedy approach to immigration. 2005. And then he was caught red-handed using illegals to cut his grass. In fact, I think Giuliani referred to his sanctuary mansion last night, or whatever it was. I mean, the man has no moral core at all. I don't understand it. And by the way, he was a lousy governor. A lousy governor. Left the state in terrible shape. How did I get into this? Oh.
Well, you were answering the question on immigration.
Yeah.
You're still on target. You're still on target.
So, while, you know, it's a hot-button issue and people get, I mean, you know, part of the challenge in public life, as all of us know, Pat, you and Barbara and those of us who hold elective office, is how in the face of what oftentimes is temporary public outrage, which you think is ill-advised, do you kind of try to do the right thing, say the right thing, and act in the public interest, even though it's, you know that at least temporarily it's going to lose you some support. Well, that's the test, folks, you know. I mean, can you stand up and try to do the right thing as you understand it and as best you can determine it, even when public sentiment is going in a different direction? I mean, there you are, and you face this all the time. But looked at realistically, Lord, if you sent all those people back, the economy of Southern California would collapse in a second. I mean, these folks would have to go out and cut their own grass. Can you believe that? So would Romney, by the way, if he knew how. I don't know. But I think the approach that passed the Senate, at least I think it passed the Senate, didn't it? And then got derailed in the House.
Yes.
Is probably the right approach to deal with what is a very difficult problem. If we get substantial Democratic majorities in both branches, I think that will be an approach that's adopted next time around. I mean, assuming we get the right president. But in the meantime, yeah, I want to see the law enforced. I don't think it's been enforced effectively at all, and it's basically been ignored, as I say, by administrations of both parties now for the past 20 years.
Okay, our last question, right here.
Could you comment on the concept of federal funding of federal elections, state funding of state elections?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've ever been asked it. You want the feds to take care of the federal election state? I don't know. I don't think I have a problem with the current system and the fact that state and local governments are primarily responsible for running elections. I do think we could take a serious look at some federal standards. I mean, for example, do you have electronic voting here? Touch voting and all that kind of stuff?
Some places.
I mean, that's a mistake, folks. You've got to have a contemporaneous record that can be counted if, for some reason, there's a dispute over the election. Now, in my state, thanks to an enlightened Secretary of State who essentially ordered this, we now vote with paper ballots. It's a card. You fill it out with a black marker. It's counted electronically. But if there's any dispute about the count, you have these cards, and you can take them out and you can count them one by one by one. That system or something like it, in my judgment, I don't know if it's a funding issue, it ought to be mandated nationally. I don't think we ought to allow this kind of stuff where you can... And I'm not one of these people that believe in conspiracies and somebody get into the machines and stuff. It's not credible to have voting machinery where you cannot assemble the documents and count them if in fact you have a dispute over the election. And that, it seems to me, Congress could mandate it. At least I think they can. But I don't see any reason why state and local governments shouldn't continue to pay for the cost of elections. I mean, remember, in every, quote, federal election, there are all kinds of state and local folks that are on the ballot. So I don't know how you kind of divide that up unless I'm missing something here. But I certainly think we could use some federal standards.
I did say one, but it's one. But when I said come to the front, there was a person in front the whole time, too. So could we have this? And this will be the last question. Thank you.
Governor, my name is Don Lindsay. I'm just curious why almost all politicians are terrified of the word taxes. And also, I'd like to know, did Tip O'Neill have any influence on your political career?
Well, Tip O'Neill was my congressman, although when my town was added to his district after about 2 terms, he did his best successfully to get us into somebody else's district, because he said he never got so much mail in his life, and he said they wrote you when they agreed with you, you know. But he was an extraordinary guy, and his son was my lieutenant governor and a great guy, and we had a wonderful experience together. So, yeah, I mean, he had a lot of influence on me. And by the way, a guy who notwithstanding the winds of political change, would stick to his guns. Remember the pounding he was getting? They even found some guy that looked like him, did those ads on him, and so on and so forth. But in the end, he prevailed. Now, what was question number 1?
Taxes.
Why are they terrified about the word taxes? I don't know, folks. I mean, our infrastructure in this country is falling apart. Now, look, if we weren't spending $4 billion a week in Iraq, we could do a lot of infrastructure, right? Look, as some of you may know, I'm rail obsessive, to put it mildly. Jonathan, somebody said something about building a transit system, but I was on the board of Amtrak. Is there any doubt that this country needs a first-class national rail passenger system? I mean, is there any doubt about that? If we could spend 5 days, not a week, 5 days of Amtrak, 5 days of Iraq every year on Amtrak, we could have an excellent national rail passenger system. That's it, 5 days. So the first thing you do, needless to say, is take a look at where you're spending your money, right? But these tax cuts, mostly for the wealthy, which were voted in the first few years of the Bush administration, in my opinion, were not only outrageously unfair, they tossed us back into deficit land after we'd finally climbed into surplus land for the first time in 40 years. And here we are again. Now, the national debt, folks, is at $7 trillion. Our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids will be paying for that for the rest of their lives. And we were on our way to zero deficit. Remember? Alan Greenspan was worried there wouldn't be any more federal debt, so how could the Federal Reserve manage the economy? I mean, no, I'm serious. We were talking about that. So those tax cuts should not be renewed for people making the kinds of income that got the vast benefit of these things. We ought to get out of this war, and we ought to start putting our resources in the kinds of things that are important to us. And if we did that, you know, we wouldn't necessarily have to raise broad-based taxes, but we start spending our money. Barbara, can I say just one final thing before wrapping up?
You certainly can.
It's great to be here, and great to be in this place. Bob Dole and I didn't agree on a lot of things, but I had a lot of respect for him. And in one particular case, when the 50 governors, led by 4 people named Dukakis, Clinton, Kane, and Castle, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, came up with a broad-based comprehensive welfare reform program in 1988, Bob Dole was our champion, and I never forgot it. There was one other thing. There is one other thing about Bob Dole, which I really sympathize with, particularly since we both ran for the presidency unsuccessfully. Any of you who know him know that he's got one of the most delicious senses of humor I have ever. He is one of the funniest guys I've ever met. And you got no sense of that, did you, in 1996? And I don't know whether it was the people around him who said, now don't try to be funny. But he's one of the funniest guys I've ever known, and a guy who I've admired and respected for a long time and worked with on a number of important issues, including, by the way, Pat, the issue that we care about a lot when we were working on legislation in the 80s. And when you see him, and when he comes back, Barbara, will you just tell him that Mike Dukakis has been honored to be invited to speak at his institute. I really mean that. So, thanks for having me.
And we have been honored to have you.
Thank you. Thanks, my dear. Thank you. Thanks.